James, thank you. And Michael McConnell will be commentator. Michael.
Well, Matt Adler, as commentator on the last paper, commented on feeling like Rip Van Winkle, awakening from 2009. I am Rip Van Winkle, awakening from 1987. I wrote 2 articles on the Contracts Clause in 1987 and haven't returned to the subject since. And I'm very grateful both to Professor Ely and to the organizers for waking me up, because this is really quite a fascinating topic. I am going to be maybe a bit unfair to Professor Ely in that I'm going to focus exclusively on the question of the coverage of the clause of public contracts or not. And I do that because I have no quarrel with his general narrative of the clause, but I am not convinced that the coverage of public contracts is well taken. And I'm going to try my best to explain why I have misgivings, and maybe to relate that to some of the methodological questions that can plague originalist scholarship. So Professor Ely, and I should also say I share Professor Ely's deep skepticism of Benjamin Wright. I didn't go back and reread this in preparation for this event, but I do recall believing that Benjamin Wright was very heavily driven by his economic theories rather than by the original evidence. So I do not share Benjamin Wright's politics, and so I think I'm going to be innocent of that particular problem. So Professor Ely begins the discussion of the private-public contract question on page 17, and he begins by examining the language of the clause in light of its drafting history. So he points out that the word private does not appear in the Contracts Clause, and he correctly notes that there's reason to think that isn't accidental. How do we know it's not accidental? It's because the proposal upon which it is based, that is Rufus King's motion to add a clause in the language of the Northwest Ordinance, specifically refers to private. Indeed, when Rufus King makes his motion, he does not quote the Northwest Ordinance, which has various limitations to it, but the only particular point about the Northwest Ordinance that Rufus King mentions in his very short motion was that it would protect private contracts. And then, as Professor Ely points out, the Committee on Style comes out with a final proposal that does not have the word private, thus raising the question. So I'm not persuaded by this argument for several reasons. One of them is I think we need to, when thinking about questions of this sort, we need to ask, what might they have been thinking? And in this case, the fragmentary evidence forces us, we don't really know much about what they were thinking. It requires a bit of sort of lawyerly exercise of what would a good lawyer back then have been thinking. Is there a reason why the word private might have been dropped other than a deliberate, conspicuous attempt to cover public contracts? And I'd like to suggest that there's one rather obvious reason why this might have happened. That's sovereign immunity. That is, if we're talking about the violation of contracts by a state, and if we assume that sovereign immunity was part of the backdrop understandings of what's going on, no one was going to be able to sue a state for violation of its own contracts, and thus there was no need to confine the terms of the clause to private contracts. Public contracts weren't going to be covered anyway. Everyone knew that, and so it simply didn't matter. Professor Ely comments trenchantly on the fact that that silence greets the Committee of Styles new proposal. Nobody even comments on the deletion of the word private, from which he concludes that that must mean that everyone agreed that public contracts are included. I think an equally plausible explanation of the silence is that everybody understood that it didn't make any difference that the word private was dropped, because given sovereign immunity, public contracts aren't going to be covered anyway. I also think that we need to examine the drafting history in some greater detail, because Professor Ely, the way he characterizes this is he says that Rufus King's proposal was defeated. Well, that is not quite complete. So Rufus King makes his proposal. There are several comments. Gouverneur Morris opposes it, thinking that it is going too far. George Mason opposes it, saying it's going too far. Madison sort of supports it, saying, yes, this clause will cause inconveniences, but it's probably worth it to have the clause. And then James Wilson unequivocally supports the proposal, but he says it only is going to apply to retrospective laws. Now, footnote, the Northwest Ordinance specifically applies only to contracts previously made. Thus, it was expressly limited to retrospective applications. That was dropped by the Committee on Detail, and yet Wilson believes that that limitation survives being dropped. I don't really understand why we would interpret the dropping of the word private as changing the amendment, whereas dropping the reference to previously made does not make the clause apply to future contracts. But in any event, Wilson limits, he says the clause is only going to apply to retrospective contracts, whereupon Madison says, well, if that's so, then we don't need it because we've already prohibited actions that are retrospective in the ex post facto clause. Madison isn't quite right. They haven't yet added an ex post facto clause applicable to the states. Rutledge makes a motion adding one, and then nobody considers the Rufus King proposal again. I suggest that that does not mean that the Rufus King proposal was defeated. What that means is that they believe that the Rufus King proposal was effectuated through an ex post facto clause. Next day, John Dickinson comes back and reports that he's been reading Blackstone, always a good thing to do, and that ex post facto laws just apply to criminal laws. So it turns out Rutledge's alternative proposal does not accomplish Rufus King's end, but nobody does anything about it until the Committee on Detail, on which Rufus King sits. So there are 5 members of the Committee of Detail, and Rufus King is a member. And look who else is a member. It so happens that of the 5 members of the Committee of Detail, that 3 of them had actually spoken, had been among the 4 who spoke on the subject of Rufus King's proposal. So you have Rufus King himself, you have Gouverneur Morris, who thought that Rufus King's proposal went too far. You have Madison, who said that it would produce inconveniences, but nonetheless is a pretty good idea, which might make you think that the point of the Committee of Detail is to reduce some of those inconveniences. I don't know. And then you have Alexander Hamilton, who at this point has not spoken to the clause, although he will later issue a legal opinion about the clause. We don't know what he thinks. And William Johnson, and we don't know what he thinks. But we do know that Rufus King and Gouverneur Morris are on the committee, and they produce a version of Rufus King's proposal that, according to Professor Ely and Chief Justice Marshall, expands the clause. I think that's at least improbable, given that Rufus King believed that private contracts were what should be protected, and Gouverneur Morris thought it went too far. It seems a little bit odd that they would produce, the committee would then produce a draft that goes even farther. I don't consider that conclusive, but it does suggest to me that the idea that the drafting history powerfully supports Chief Justice Marshall's reading is not correct. We then turn, or Professor Ely then turns to the state ratifying conventions and says there isn't much said. He said only one Federalist specifically argued that the clause was confined to private contracts. That's William R. Davie of North Carolina. That's one way of putting it. Another way to put it is that no one who supported the Constitution said that it extended to public contracts. The only person in any of the ratifying conventions who says that is Patrick Henry, and he regards it as a charge against the clause and against the Constitution. So no one affirmatively supports it. Then, since I'm down to 1 minute, there are several post-ratification interpretations. I think that if you look very carefully at these interpretations by Hamilton and Patterson, you will see that they do not actually support the conclusion. I'd like to just especially call attention to Hamilton, since he's a favorite of mine. And Hamilton is hired to write an opinion which supports the supports the idea that the clause is going to extend to public contracts. And this is what Hamilton has to say. It's quoted on page 27 of the paper. Hamilton says that every grant from one to another, whether the grantor shall be a state or an individual, is virtually a contract. Hamilton is very careful with words. It's virtually a contract. I think that means it's not actually a contract, but almost a contract. That the grantee shall hold and enjoy the thing granted against the grantor and his representatives. It therefore appears to me that taking the terms of the Constitution in their large sense and giving them effect according to the general spirit and policy of the provisions, that they might be considered to cover public contracts. Now, Hamilton is using familiar language from equitable interpretation, which contrasts with legal interpretation. Legal interpretation does not look to the general spirit and policy of the provision, but rather to its specific terms. I think that any contract clause case is going to arise in a legal rather than an equitable context. I'm not sure of that, but it seems very likely. And I think that Hamilton, even though he's been paid to write an opinion going out the other way, is too honest a lawyer to say that the position is actually right, but he says it might be stretched using equitable interpretation to cover public contracts. That does not seem to me to be very powerful evidence that that's what the clause means. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I suppose the other possibility of Hamilton's reference to a virtual contract is that Hamilton thought that this was a digital or computer-generated contract. I have three troikas, a troika of troikas, and the beginning of a fourth troika. So first, non-Soviet troika, Chris Green, Christina Mulligan, and Shakira Sanders. Chris.
You didn't want to give James a chance to
respond? But before all of that, that was my original intent.
But not your original public meaning.
Not your original.
James.
Okay, thank you. Well, those are some very thoughtful comments, and they highlight, I think, one of the difficulties in trying to reconstruct the scope, if you will, of the contract clause from the very fragmentary evidence that we have before us. It's not my thesis, of course, that the drafting history proves Marshall is correct. I simply argue that he is a plausible interpretation based on the history that we have. I do give some weight to the reformulation of the clause as it was adopted. It is difficult to know quite why the Committee on Style came up with the wording that it did. That raises the question of who really was the author of the contract clause. most historians have debated two people, Hamilton and Wilson, who, although not a member, might have been the actual author and persuaded Hamilton to present the clause. I do not know why some of the others might have changed their minds, might have been persuaded to change their minds, might have rethought the matter. That's, I think, something that simply we cannot reconstruct. But in any event, they did not object. They didn't raise any questions about it, which they could easily have done, or indeed, if there was a majority that didn't want, they could have voted it out. So I think that it's very difficult for us to get behind that. It was entering simply into a realm of conjecture. The idea, incidentally, that the contract clause might have a prospective reach did not die immediately by any means. You know, Marshall endeavored to resurrect it in a later opinion. One of the few times he was on the losing side of a constitutional argument, and I think I would be in accord with most historians and with James Wilson that the contract clause was phrased to deal with retrospective interference with existing contracts and not to apply to state ability to regulate the making of future contracts. The sovereign immunity argument is an interesting one. I've confronted that before. I would point out, however, that whatever the states thought, they rapidly found they were in fact going to be sued. And that gave rise to Chilson v. Georgia and to the 11th Amendment, which was enacted in response to that. That was a case in which creditors thought they should be paid. And Georgia resisted, and several members of the Supreme Court, in the course of rendering opinions there, expressly took the view that a state would be bound to honor its contracts. And this was all, you know, just, the dust had barely settled on the Philadelphia Convention when this took place. So I wonder to what extent sovereign immunity bulked that large. Remember, the whole purpose of the contract clause and the other provisions in that section of the Constitution was to limit state power. The framers had been, as a group, I think, not happy with how the states had acted in connection with paper money and debtor-creditor and you know, the whole list of things. And also that their activities were embarrassing the United States, the newly independent United States abroad. I think that this was definitely an attempt to clip state authority. So with that, we turn to our various troikas.